The entire room erupted into enthusiastic applause when my father proudly handed my younger sister the keys to the mountain estate. She smirked before her manicured fingers even brushed the polished metal, her chin tilting upward in a silent, arrogant victory. Everyone in our family already knew what this party was actually about. Elena had always been the favorite. She was the beautiful daughter, the charismatic daughter, the highly successful corporate Lederklimper whom my parents endlessly claimed deserved the absolute best life had to offer. I stood quietly near the back of the grand stone fireplace room, blending into the shadows as dozens of relatives toasted to her latest achievement. My father raised his crystal glass high, catching the warm light of the chandelier, and announced that the multi-million-dollar Aspen Lodge, our family's crown jewel, would now officially and legally belong to Elena. The cheers got louder, echoing off the high wood-beamed ceilings. My name is Maya Vance. I was 31 years old when my family gathered for what everyone firmly believed would be my sister's ultimate triumph. At least, that's what they had scripted in their minds. My sister Elena was younger by 3 years, but she had spent her entire life occupying the center of our parents' universe. My parents would never openly admit to having a favorite, of course, but favoritism doesn't need a public confession. It shows in the details. Elena got the unearned praise, the undivided attention, and the endless second chances. If Elena managed to scrape by with a mediocre passing grade, it was celebrated as a stroke of genius. If I brought home a flawless academic report, it was treated as a basic baseline obligation. After enough years of watching the scale tilt, you stop fighting reality. You don't scream, you don't cry. You simply learn exactly where you stand, and you build your own foundation. I became fiercely independent early on. I carved out my own path in industrial design, working 80-hour weeks to launch my own firm. I paid my own bills, purchased my own downtown loft without a single dime of family assistance, and manufactured my own opportunities out of pure grit. Meanwhile, Elena enjoyed being the perpetual sun around which my parents orbited. When she finally completed her master's degree from an elite European business school, a degree heavily subsidized by my father, my parents decided to throw the most lavish, expensive family celebration we had ever seen. The location wasn't chosen at random. It was held at Grandma Evelyn's mountain estate, an architectural masterpiece nestled in the Rockies that had been the pride of our family for over 45 years. Some of my absolute happiest childhood memories were anchored inside those stone and timber walls. Winter ski trips, roasting marshmallows by the massive outdoor fire pit, crisp autumn mornings hiking the trails with Grandma, and long, quiet evenings watching the stars blanket the snow-capped peaks from the heated wraparound deck. But over the last decade, a quiet family assumption had slowly hardened into an undisputed fact. Everyone blindly believed that Elna would inherit the entire estate. Nobody ever questioned it. Not our aunts, not our uncles, and especially not Elena. The week before the grand celebration, she had called my cell phone, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive vanity. "You should really see the architectural renovation mood boards I've been putting together, Maya," she said, practically humming over the line. I frowned, shifting my drafting pen to my other hand. Renovation boards? For what? For the Aspen Lodge, obviously. She laughed casually as if speaking to a child. I mean, once Dad officially signs the deed over to me at the graduation party, I'm completely gutting that old-fashioned rustic kitchen. The absolute, unshakable confidence in her voice was impossible to miss. She wasn't even pretending to respect Grandma's legacy anymore. She was already treating the estate like her personal playground. When the day of the party finally arrived, dozens of extended family members packed the sprawling property. High-end catering staff moved through the crowd, tables overflowed with gourmet food, and people carried premium cocktails while talking excitedly about Elena's brilliant future. Every single conversation, without fail, seemed to revolve entirely around her. At one point during the afternoon, I walked past a group of our aunts discussing future plans for the property. Elena will definitely modernize the guest wings, one whispered. The original stone fireplace is a bit dated anyway. She should replace it with minimalist glass. Nobody spoke as if ownership was a variable. In their minds, the verdict had been handed down years ago. Around twilight, as the sun began to dip behind the majestic peaks, my father tapped his silver spoon against his glass to command the room's attention. The crowd eagerly gathered near the grand patio overlooking the mountains. Elena immediately glided to the very front, smiling radiantly, perfectly poised, and entirely certain of what was coming next. Dad wrapped a proud arm tightly around her shoulders. We are all gathered here today to celebrate Elena's incredible milestone. A loud burst of applause erupted. My mother stood to the side, delicately wiping away tears of pure pride. Dad reached deep into his blazer pocket. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out a heavy, custom-engraved brass key ring, the keys to the mountain estate. The crowd immediately caught on. Loud cheers and whistles broke out across the deck. Elena's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with absolute satisfaction. Your mother and I couldn't be prouder of the woman you've become, Dad said, his voice thick with emotion. You've worked hard, and it's time for the next spectacular chapter of your life. He placed the heavy brass keys directly into Elena's open palm. The applause reached a deafening crescendo. Several relatives stepped forward, flashes from their phones blinking rapidly to capture the historic family moment. Elena held the keys up high, letting them catch the fading sunlight like a hard-earned trophy. For a split second, it felt like the entire universe was bending to validate her dominance. And then, a sudden, heavy sound cut straight through the celebration. The harsh, distinct sound of a heavy oak chair scraping against the stone flooring cut sharply through the laughter. The applause died down almost instantly. Everyone turned their heads toward the back of the room. The family's longtime estate attorney, Arthur Pendleton, slowly stood up from his seat near the corner. He wasn't smiling. In fact, his face carried an unusually grave, unreadable expression. Dad blinked, his hand still resting on Elena's shoulder. Is everything all right, Arthur? Joining us for a toast? The lawyer adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, stepping out into the light. Actually, Marcus, there is one critical legal matter regarding this estate that must be addressed immediately. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Arthur reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick legal-grade envelope. It was slightly faded at the edges, sealed tightly with red wax. Across the front, written in the sharp, unmistakable, elegant cursive of our late Grandma Evelyn, were 9 words. To be opened exclusively after Elena's master's graduation celebration. Suddenly, nobody was clinking glasses anymore. A strange, uneasy tension filled the room. And for the first time all evening, the triumphant smile on Elena's face faltered. The festive atmosphere vanished in an instant, replaced by a heavy, suffocating curiosity. Dad forced a booming laugh, though his eyes narrowed. Arthur, what is this? Some kind of sentimental graduation letter from my mother? This is a final, legally binding instruction left by Evelyn Vance, the attorney replied smoothly, breaking the wax seal with a small silver pocket knife. Grandma Evelyn had passed away nearly 5 years ago, but as the crisp white paper unfolded in Arthur's hands, her fierce, uncompromising presence instantly filled the room again. Elena shifted uneasily, her fingers tightening around the brass keys. I'm sure this is just an old blessing or a family poem, she muttered, her voice slightly strained. We can read it later? I am legally obligated to read it now, Arthur countered calmly. He raised the pages and began to read aloud. If you are hearing these words, it means Elena has completed her formal education, and my family is gathered at the mountain lodge. Several aunts and uncles exchanged stunned glances. The letter had been meticulously timed for this exact hour. Arthur continued reading. For the past decade, I have watched many of you silently assume that this estate, the crown jewel of our family's history, would pass directly into Elena's hands upon her graduation. Elena's smile twitched back into place for a fraction of a second. But then Arthur read the very next line. That assumption is entirely, fundamentally incorrect. The room went dead silent. You could hear the wind howling against the glass panes of the lodge. My father froze, his glass hovering midair. What did you just say? Arthur didn't skip a beat, reading directly from the script Grandma had left behind. This mountain estate was never intended to pass to any individual family member as a gift of favoritism. It was placed into a private protected asset trust years ago to ensure its preservation. Whispers broke out like wildfire among the relatives. Elena looked at Dad, her face flushing a deep crimson. Dad, what is he talking about? You said the house deed was yours to give. It isn't, Arthur interjected, turning to the next page. The Vance Family Trust shall activate fully upon the conclusion of Elena's graduation. At that precise moment, all management authority, financial control, deed ownership, and structural decision-making responsibility shall transfer entirely to the sole trustee I personally selected. Elena folded her arms, her jaw clenching as she glared at the attorney. Fine. So who did she pick? My father? Arthur lowered the papers, his eyes scanning the crowd before locking directly onto me in the back row. Olivia Vance. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Elena stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer disbelief. Dad froze, his face losing its color, while my mother looked completely paralyzed. Finally, Elena let out a short, nervous laugh that completely lacked its usual confidence. Okay, Arthur. Very funny joke. Did Maya pay you to read this? Arthur didn't even blink. I'm afraid this is entirely serious, Elena. The color completely drained from my sister's face. Arthur opened a secondary leather folder, stepping toward me. The trust documents were locked and filed years ago. Upon the activation clause this evening, all access credentials, bank accounts tied to the estate, and legal deed controls transferred automatically to Maya's name at exactly 5 p.m. He handed me a thick, heavy packet. Inside were official trust records, land registration documents, and the master authorization forms bearing Grandma Evelyn's official notary stamp. Everything was airtight. Everything was legally unassailable. Dad stepped forward, his voice tight. Arthur, there has to be a mistake. I am the executor of her main estate. I approved. There is no mistake, Marcus. Arthur replied calmly. Your mother personally designed this specific arrangement outside of the primary will. She wanted to ensure the integrity of the lodge. The backyard deck erupted into furious whispers among our relatives. Elena looked absolutely livid, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the useless brass keys. Why would Grandma do this to me? This was supposed to be my house. Why would she backstab me like this? Arthur picked up the letter one final time to deliver Grandma's final message. Because ownership requires responsibility. The attorney continued reading Grandma's exact words. Elena has many wonderful charismatic qualities, but true trust is earned through consistency, discipline, and quiet stewardship. Elena consumes, she does not build. The crowd went completely silent. Maya has demonstrated those exact qualities for over a decade, Arthur read, his voice echoing over the mountains. She never asked for my recognition, nor did she demand a spotlight. She simply handled heavy responsibility whenever it appeared, building her own foundation with integrity. I am leaving my greatest asset to the person who knows how to protect it. My throat tightened. I suddenly remembered the long, deep conversations I used to have with Grandma on this very deck during those summer nights while everyone else was inside sleeping off the party. Back then, I thought she was just sharing old stories about her life. Now, with a wave of emotion, I realized she had been teaching me, preparing me, and quietly watching to see who had the spine to hold the family's legacy together. Elena shook her head, tears of pure anger welling in her eyes. This isn't fair. This is completely sabotaging my graduation. For the first time all evening, I stepped out of the shadows and spoke. My voice was calm, measured, and entirely steady. It was never about being fair, Elena. Everyone in the family turned to look at me. It was about protecting what Grandma spent her entire life building, I said, looking her dead in the eye. The fiery anger slowly began to leave Elena's face, replaced by the cold, heavy weight of reality settling in. The keys in her hand were just metal now. They didn't open a single legal door without my signature. I turned toward the rest of my shell-shocked family. Nobody is being banned from the lodge. The estate stays in the Vance family, exactly how Grandma wanted it. The traditions won't change, but the management will. My mother began to weep quietly into her handkerchief, and Dad slowly lowered his eyes to the floorboards. Years of blatant favoritism, unearned praise, and superficial entitlement suddenly looked incredibly small and fragile compared to the quiet truth sitting inside the legal documents in my hands. The sun finally dipped completely below the jagged mountain peaks, throwing the entire Rockies into a deep, majestic twilight. And for the rest of that night, nobody was looking at the gold keys in Elena's hand. They were looking at the woman holding the future of the estate. Because for years, my family believed Grandma would leave the mountain lodge to the daughter they loved the most. But in the end, she left it to the person she trusted the most,